There's a question about the meaning of the little horn. Just what does it represent here in chapter 8? There are three different claims regarding it. One is that the little horn of chapter 8 is very different than the little horn of chapter 7. Another view is that the chapter 8 little horn represents the same thing as chapter 7, but that it also includes the beast of Rome as well as the little horn, that is as the papacy. In other words, the view is that it represents pagan Rome and papal Rome. And the other view is that it represents only papal Rome, as does chapter 7. Because in chapter 7, it's the beast that represents pagan Rome, and the little horn only represents the papacy. Well, now there are many Seventh-day Adventists who take the second view, that it represents both pagan Rome and papal Rome. And those point out the fact that it was Rome that exalted itself even to the prince of the host by crucifying Christ. However, I am of the opinion that the little horn of Daniel 7, the little horn of Daniel 8 are exactly the same little horn. In fact, all the characteristics are the same. It seems very evident that it represents the papacy, but where is Rome in this? In the chapter 8, we have the ram with two horns, which represents Medo-Persia, the goat with the primary horn before his eyes that breaks off and the four others come up for it, which represents Greece. Well, now, the little horn, the papacy did not come up out of Greece. So there are many who feel that then the little horn must be paganism as papal Rome, because there has to be pagan Rome first. However, that does not seem to be a problem to me, because every horn has to be attached to some beast. And notice that the little horn does not come out of one of the other horns, it comes out of one of the winds, one of the directions, which is the western direction. So that I see this as a little horn coming out of Rome, which is in the west. And it is pressing eastward and southward and toward the pleasant land from that beast which carries it. The little horn becomes very great, exceeding great, and it grows out toward all of these others and encompasses them. So I would see that little horn as being the same thing as we see in Daniel 7. And all of the characteristics of it are the same. Things equal to the same things are equal to each other. So what we have in Daniel 8 is the same little horn. It is attached to Rome, but Rome is not seen. Rome is the beast, but it is off camera. It does not show up, but the horn indicates that it's there. So the little horn then does, in my opinion, represent the papacy. And throughout the chapter, it fits when we identify it as a papacy, and we don't have to worry about the papacy not coming out of Greece, as it doesn't. It comes out of Rome. It comes out of that beast, which is not seen here, but implied by the fact that the horn is there and growing and coming outward. It has to be on an animal, and that animal is a symbol of Rome. There's a question that many have regarding the little horn. Just what is the little horn of chapter 8? We find in chapter 7 a little horn, but that little horn follows the nondescript beast. We have the lion, which is Babylon, the bear, which is Medo-Persia, the leopard, which is Greece, and the nondescript beast that has 10 horns, and out of that one other little horn comes and uproots 3 of the former 10. Now in Daniel 8, there is no reference to Babylon. It begins with the ram and states clearly that the ram represents the kings of Medo-Persia. Then it states that the goat represents Greece. Then it speaks of the little horn. It doesn't say anything about Rome. But there are many people who believe that the little horn is both pagan Rome and papal Rome, whereas in chapter 7, the little horn of chapter 7 is only the papacy. Now the question of the little horn being the papacy, paganism and the papacy, it's pointed out that Rome itself seems to fulfill the prophecy because it exalted itself above the prince of the host. Now that prince of the host is Christ. And they point out the fact that it was Rome, the Roman government, that crucified Christ. However, that does not satisfy my mind because it was not the Roman government that exalted itself above Christ. It was the Jews who crucified Christ. Pilate tried to save Christ. He went through many efforts to try to save him, including giving them opportunity to choose between Christ and Barabbas. And they said, we want Barabbas, crucify Christ. And then finally, he washed his hands of the whole thing. He says, I'm not going to be held guilty of crucifying this innocent man. So Rome did not rise up against Christ and crucify him. His own people rose up against him and crucified him. But then how do we understand the question of moving from the goat, which now has 4 horns, 4 different divisions of power? How do we go from the goat, which represents Greece, to papacy, where is pagan Rome? Pagan Rome was the longest government of all, much longer than any of the others. Now, where is Rome in this? It is interesting that all of Daniel's prophecies are parallel. Now, this loses the parallelism if we have no evidence of Rome, and that's why it is assumed that the horn represents both paganism and papacy at the same time, each one of them rising up against the prince of the host. Well, I suggest that if there is a horn, there is an animal. We do not see, the animal is not visible in the prophecy. Nothing is said about the animal. But it speaks of this little horn coming and moving in a direction of south and east and toward the pleasant land. Now the fact is, if that horn is growing massively and being carried, it has an animal behind it. That animal behind it represents Rome, the same as the nondescript beast of chapter 7. So if we understand it that way, we are not confused by the question of how you can go from Greece to the papacy. The 4 winds indicates that it's not coming from one of the horns. It's coming from the western direction. And it's very clear that it says out of one of them, not one of the horns, but one of the winds. And the grammar requires that we understand it as one of the winds or one of the directions. Now before we complete this, we come back to the question, who crucified Christ? Was it the Romans or was it the Jews? Who cried, crucify him, crucify him? It was his own people. And so it was that the people of Israel rose up against their own seed, their own Savior, and crucified him. And they stated, his blood be upon us and our children. The Roman governor did not say, his blood be upon me. He washed his hands and said, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. You go ahead and do it, but I'm not going to do it. And so it was not the Roman government that rose up against Christ. It was his own people. And as we move along, we need to keep that in mind, that the little horn of chapter 8 is identical to the little horn of chapter 7. And what it says about 8 is the same thing as what it says about 7. Somewhat different wording, but the same message. The wording of chapter 7 is that the little horn wears out the saints of the Most High and changes times and laws, seeks to change times and laws. In the chapter 8 little horn, it shows that he rises up against the host and casts down the host and the stars and stamps on them, which is a more extreme expression of the same thing it says in chapter 7. Moreover, we find in chapter 8, so in chapter 8, it has the little horn exalting himself even to the prince of the host and taking away his sanctuary ministry. And blasphemy in chapter 7, it speaks of blasphemy. Chapter 8, it also does by showing he rises against the prince of the host and casts down his sanctuary, which means the ministry. By the way, it says he cast down the place of his sanctuary. So the people looking to the earthly priests to do what only Christ in heaven can do. Now, just this morning, someone sent me an attachment, and that attachment tells about the meeting of the Protestant ministers with the Pope very recently, since the Pope has been in America. And it states there several things that are very significant. For one, one of the pastors apologizes to the Pope that's claiming that Protestants have been bearing for a long time many heresies, and now they're going back to the Mother Church and the truth. The fact is that the Protestant ministers have now had Mass with the Pope. Now, to understand how serious that is, the Mass has to do with the belief that the priest, in his Latin words, actually creates his creator. And that is a statement of one of their own men in the past. He actually, great is the power, they say, of the priest, for he creates his creator. How does he do that? By mumbling those words over the Latin words. Presumably, he actually produces Christ right there, and Christ is bodily, according to them, present in the bread. Blood is literally present in the wine. Now, if that isn't blasphemy, but the whole Protestant group now have not only taken Mass, but they've also gone to confession, and at least some of them telling about how wonderful it was, what a great experience they had in the confession. The Bible says we're to confess to no man but to Christ. He is our only confessor. And if we feel great, it's certain that the enemy of souls would give them a wonderful feeling when they're doing his biddings. But this is where we are today. If you study the chapter 13, and we will come to that in our study of Revelation, But read chapter 13 and you will see what is actually happening today is the final conflict between good and evil is about to take place, and its beginnings are already starting.